Diane, welcome to the news today. This is the world we live in, but these same people, many people would say psychopaths, sociopaths, have got plans for the globe as a whole. What can you tell us?
Thanks, Brian, and hello, Ben. It's good to be here today. Yeah, I have a globalist report that hopefully will kind of situate some of these things for you, including just a bit about Ukraine, which will come later on in the segment. So for those of you who are going to be in New York for the next week or so, starting this weekend, the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly is happening. So in case you wanted to pop into some of their meetings, they'll be right there for you. And Debbie Evans has covered earlier this year in her blog and on the news the Summit of the Future, which is a specific high-level event which will be happening as part of, or sort of, I think, before the General Assembly takes place. And what is the Summit of the Future? Well, you can go back and look at Debbie's reports, but ultimately what it says is they are going to be working on a pact for the future to chart a path toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or as I call them, unsustainable, and responding to emerging challenges and opportunities, which will include a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations as annexes. So there are 5 key themes for the pact. Some of these should start to sound familiar to you. The one at the top is sustainable development, which is the one I'm going to go into. International peace and security, science, technology, innovation, youth and future generations, and transforming global governance. So just as a review, Sustainable Development Goal 13 is what they call climate action at the UN and other related organizations. Here at the UK column, I call it You Will Not Breathe, because this is all about what they are going to do to us and the impact it will have on us. So I want to go back into history and also bring us back into the future, just to kind of show where some of this a little bit of globalism, a little bit of sustainable development, and to raise some potential possibilities that I see in some of the research I've been doing around this recently. So if any of you were around in 1972 and remember, there was a bestseller by the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. And the Club of Rome was started in 1972 was when this was published, but in 1968, Dr. Aurelio Pachai, who was one of the 3 co-founders of the Club of Rome, got 30 people together in Rome to discuss what he called the present and future predicament of man. Now, the 3 founders of the Club of Rome were a philanthropist, which was Dr. Aurelio Pachai, a chemist, and a banker. The banker was David Rockefeller. And so, of course, with a chemist, a banker, and a philanthropist all together, what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, we have the Club of Rome as a result. And so that was published in 1972. So now I want to go into someone who I don't believe has been covered on the column recently or at all, as far as I can tell, may have been, but this is someone that I found out about from a new friend of mine that I met at the Academies of Ideas conference that I went to a few weeks ago. And his name is Dr. Paul Raskin. Dr. Paul Raskin got a PhD in 1970 in theoretical physics from Columbia University. His thesis was high energy particle potentials and their application to the scattering of particles off nuclei. Now, you might wonder what that has to do with sustainable development, but I'm wondering if I haven't been able to read his thesis, but I'm wondering what happened between 1970 and 1976. 1972, the Club of Rome report was published. 1976, Dr. Raskin founded the Energy Systems Research Group, ESRG. In 1980, he was part of a report that was sent to U.S. Congress called New England Can Reduce Its Oil Dependence Through Conservation and Renewable Resource Development. In 1990, ESRG became renamed as the Tellus Institute. And according to the website, they have conducted over 3,500 projects throughout the world, becoming internationally recognized in sustainable development. And that's since 1976. When they remember that Tellus, which was something that I think is interesting, and remember this for later, Tellus is also the word in Roman mythology for Mother Earth. So it's basically a sort of a Gaia, a Earth worshipping kind of elements to that name. In 1995, he convened the Global Scenario Group to explore the requirements for a transition to a sustainable and just global civilization. And as of 2024, he is still alive, and the Tellus Institute is now embarked in a new phase, reframing our programs around the larger mission of advancing a just and sustainable planetary civilization. So I believe we have a video here of a bit of an interview with Dr. Raskin. If we can play that, please.
When we discuss scenarios, we talk about 3 broad channels. radiating out into the future. One we call conventional worlds, basically an evolutionary sequence of events despite hiccups like the current meltdown, that the basic paradigm and values persist into the future. The second channel is barbarization, in which markets and policies are unable to cope with the crises, and the chaos and social disruption and the environmental deterioration that is induced by conventional worlds. And you have futures of catastrophic disruption. And the third we call great transitions, where people rise to the possibilities, to the promise of this planetary phase with new values and new institutions, and development steers towards a more fortunate form of civilization.
So we have here a slide that just kind of shows, this is also on their website, The Great Transition, which is a project of the Tellus Institute and colleagues. So basically saying that trends and forces that are going on in the world lead to these potential three scenarios. So the scenarios are basically things that could happen. We could kind of stay on track to where we are. We could fall into barbarization where everything falls apart and everyone's poor and hungry. Or we could have these wonderful great transitions, which I believe are related to Marxism, as we'll see next. I won't go into a lot of detail. All of these things are in the show notes if you really want to go into the detail. I've done it so you don't have to, fortunately for the rest of you. But basically, they're pushing the line of equity to show that the great transitions scenario that they have come up with will be the most equitable, which of course, equity, as a reminder from last week from Ben Rubin, saying woke Marxism, equity means we all end up in the same place, which means that we will no longer have wealth. They're trying to do away with capitalism and replace it with communism, which I've found a lot of evidence for as I've gone through this. In the Great Transition 2002 document that they wrote, again, these are all online, freely available. We had the takeoff of the planetary transition from 1980 to 2000, when we had all this climate change, the advent of the internet, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so on. And you can see from 2000 to 2050, by the time we get to 2050, we've already had the transition. So according to them, we're in the middle of this transition as we're going through it right now. Dr. Raskin published a book called Journey to Earthland, and this and the other publications were published by the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is a research institute that tackles these environmental challenges. So obviously they're all over the World Economic Forum website, and they have locations throughout the world. One is in New York, one is in Oxford, in case you want to stop by and say hello. They worked together with the Tellus Institute for several years, and you can see a lot of evidence that throughout all of this documentation as well. So there's a copy of Journey to Earthland, where he says that Marx said that people make their own history, but not as they please. Historical necessity curbs human freedom. So that's an important point to remember for later. And we see further on in the Great Transition documents, we see a couple of papers directly quoting Marxism and ecology. And these papers point out that Marx's theory was ecological sustainability, came from Marx, which says this is the crisis of the earth, which needs to lead us from capitalism to communism. And that is central to his view of communism taking place, replacing capitalism, essentially. So where does that take us to from here? Now we look at, we have on the United Nations, where they cited Dr. Raskin's work in 2018, the role of civil society in advancing global citizenship, and just to show that, that his work is being used, even though we may not necessarily know who he is specifically, but his work is very influential. So coming back to 2022 and back to the Club of Rome again, we see in this book, Earth for All, which is a 50-year update to the publication that they started 50 years ago. So Earth for All uses the limits to growth and planetary boundaries framework. So planetary boundaries were something that came up during the work in the past with the Great Transition and colleagues that worked directly with Dr. Raskin, and we can see this in the document. So let's see a little bit of a video clip, parts of a video from the Club of Rome, who does, by the way, have a YouTube channel, and see what some of the authors from the Club of Rome said about this work.
We are proposing 5 turnarounds paid for by the 10% richest people in the world.
If we put in place the 5 turnarounds that we talk about, the focusing on inequality, the focus on poverty, the focus on empowerment, and then food and energy as the 2 key resources that will keep us alive as we're faced with some of these ongoing crises, then we actually could get ourselves out of this mess.
And the interesting thing with these 5 turnarounds is that they can be scaled from communities to cities to sectors, nations, regions, and then globally. So that's what we were looking for, like a fractal set of fractals that escalate or percolate down from the global economic system all the way down.
I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukraine war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas.
So we could see an energy democracy where local sources, microgrids, local areas don't have to rely so much on the global fossil energy system.
What we're facing is not an environmental crisis. It's a crisis of security, of stability, of prosperity and equity. And that's what Earth for All really brings forward.
So what they're trying to do with Earth for All, as they're doing, and I've read the book, most of it, so you don't have to. You certainly can if you want to, is a couple of important things that come out of it. Again, the tie with Ukraine, saying that the war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas. The last man who was speaking there was Johan Rockström. He is previously with the Stockholm Environmental Institute as well as the Stockholm Resilience Center, which were previously partnered and published the works of the Tellus Institute, as well as, he's all these people are involved in the Club of Rome. Sandrine Dixon, who was in the video, she was wearing her little Sustainable Development Goals badge very proudly. She is the co-president of the Club of Rome. And again, another important point to come out of this is that this will all be paid for by the richest 10%, which they will do by taxing higher income people and just redistributing it. So again, we see the trend towards Marxism there. It's also important to note that the whole system transformation is very important to all of this. It's not just about the climate anymore. It's not just about it's too hot or too cold or whatever. It is a whole system transformation, which includes things like gender equity, which is also in this book. So again, the end of gender, saying that basically they're going to control the population by allowing women to get more education, and therefore we will have a richer economy, which they believe therefore leads to people having fewer children. So that's the plan leading up to 2100 and how they plan to look at this population control issue. So back to the Summit of the Future, we look at the Earth for All website. So it has been restylized. It's very nice and trendy now. It has the number 4 instead of the word 4 compared to the original book. We have the nice, colorful, bright, sustainable development goals, making us feel all happy. And they have said on the 4th of September that in advance of the Summit of the Future, they have released a new report detailing 2 possible futures for sub-Saharan Africa this century. So again, they're going back to this scenario development. And instead of having things like barbarization, great transition, and conventional worlds, we now have 2 scenarios. One is called Too Little, Too Late, which is if we just kind of talk slightly about sustainability and don't really do much, we're going to be in trouble, from their point of view. The other one is the Giant Leap, in which they particularly mention universal basic income as something coming in if the Giant Leap scenario, which is of course the one they want, comes into place. That's the decrease of women having fewer babies, the population going down. And at the end of the book, it talks about valuing equality, diversity, and inclusion, and saying that is the start to valuing our future and where we need to go from here to make all of these things more equitable and just and sustainable. So what's happening in the next few days at the Summit of the Future? The Club of Rome has 3 events that they are hosting. One is the Intergenerational Leadership for Innovation and Sustainability on the 20th. On the 21st, we will be exploring proposals from the Wales Protocol for future generations and how they can build into kind of the future generations declaration that they're building. And on the 22nd of September, the high point is the high-level roundtable on equity and planetary stability featuring Sir Richard Branson himself. So we can see high-profile people going on there at the UN. And I just want to end this by asking a quick question, which is, why are we doing this? And so I want to go back to King Charles and the Terra Carta, which was part of his Sustainable Markets Initiative. And, in 2020 in Davos, he introduced the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which was a proposed set of principles leading up to 2030 that puts nature, people, and planet at the heart of global value creation. So I think there's woke Marxism going on. I think there's obviously a major financial implication here, because I think he just got it King Charles just got a 45 million pound raise, I believe. I certainly didn't get that much of a raise. And the earth worship, I think, is an important thing to keep track of. The Tellus, the people and planet and environment and nature all being together in harmony. Really that destruction of civilization that the West, the Christian views that some people have in the West, I think they're trying to do away with this by putting this into play. So those are just my thoughts. Those are just questions, Brian. But I don't know what you think.
Thank you very much for that, Diane. Well, as we've seen the quality of the politicians, wherever they are, UK or overseas, I don't think they should be allowed to drive such an agenda. But when the gentleman said that the Ukraine war was good for this transformative change for the future, I've got to say my blood went cold.